Welcome, my friends, and thanks for joining me today. I'm Lorna Schumann with the Illinois State Museum, and today we're going to talk to historian June Chappell here at the museum and learn a little bit more personal about the Great Migration. In fact, June is going to share his family's stories of the Great Migration and how they moved from the South to Illinois. So, you ready? Hey, June.
Hi, Lorna. Thank you again. And once again, we're back. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about my family. Well, as mentioned before, I am June Chappell. And my family is originally, well, goodness, I mean, I could tell you so many different places, but more recently, my family is predominantly from central and southern Louisiana, some small areas of Alabama, and central and southern South Carolina. But I'll start with talking to you about my father's family. Full disclosure, I was adopted by my maternal grandparents. So the Chappells are my maternal grandfather's side of the family biologically, or Daddy, as we all call him. So when they first came to Illinois, it was 1920, so about 101 years ago now. But here is the story. My great-great-grandfather's name was William Butler Chappell the second. He was born in South Carolina around August 22nd, 1880. His parents were free before the Civil War, but so they were free people of color, as you might call them. So around 1920, my great-great-grandfather was a businessman in the state of South Carolina, and he owned his own property. But because of the way he looked, meaning that he was white passing or someone who was racially ambiguous, and what that means is that he was genotypically black, meaning his genetics, he had African ancestry. But on the outside, he, to some people, looked like a person who was white. But that isn't how he identified. But in order to do certain business ventures in the state of South Carolina outside of his city, in North Carolina and Georgia, or even Florida, he would sometimes pass in order to get these things done. Around 1920, my grandfather had gone out after work with a friend of his, and at some point around that evening, he told that particular friend of his what he had been doing in order to do business outside of the city they lived in, which was 96, South Carolina, named after a number. I know that's a little odd, but it was a very small town. So he told his friend that he had been passing as a white man sometimes to do certain business with people outside of his city and outside of the state. That particular person that he told about his little secret had told other people within the city who were white men, and some anger started and erupted. One day while the family was out, they went to the family home in 96, South Carolina, and they opened the door, because back then I don't think that people really locked their doors as often. And in the parlor of the home, they found my uncle, John Henry. So my great-great-great uncle was sleeping in the parlor on a couch. So they pulled him out of the house thinking that it was my great-great-grandfather because they looked so much alike. They told him that it was a warning to him and his family, and to, tell them that they needed to get out of town. So after that, my great-great-grandfather and my great-great-grandmother, whose name was Millie Victoria Robinson Chappell, of Edgefield, South Carolina, they got their family and they traveled to Chicago. It was not very common for people from South Carolina to do that, because usually, because you were on the eastern seaboard, you would go upward. So places like Delaware or DC or New York City, for example, or just the state of New York, or even Maryland. Usually went up, straight up north, along the coast, or even sometimes Philadelphia, like some people in my family did. But they made their way to Chicago, where I think that we already had a few family members, and they settled there and even switched their names around out of fear that they would be eventually caught or found in case someone was looking for them. For example, I had an aunt named Luella, who we all referred to as Mother Dear, and she passed away when I was about 8 years old, and she was about 96 or 97. But her original name was actually Eunice Ella. But when they moved north, she changed her name to Luella in honor of one of her favorite aunts before leaving South Carolina.
So, would you say that your family's experience was more typical of what other African Americans who were coming on the Great Migration, or different?
I would say that it was slightly different. There was particularly from the Chappelle part of the family, they were, when I was growing up, my dad would always describe his family as well-to-do. So there was class privilege involved, that also eventually led to this spark of anger from white people in the area who were a little bit upset that a black person might have been doing better financially or economically than they were at that point in time. Oftentimes, a lot of African American people did leave the South due to being met with some sort of violence. So in a sense, it was a little bit the same, but slightly different.
So what was your family's experience when they moved to Chicago? Did it live up to what they thought it would be?
I haven't heard too many stories about an experience of racism, but I think that also has something to do with the fact that when they first moved north, from what my father told me when I was growing up, that a lot of people in the particular area they lived in Evanston, before moving further into the city, thought that they were Italian at first. So they were fairly racially ambiguous or ethnically ambiguous, so they didn't have the time that darker skinned people would have had because of something that's called light skin privilege. So I imagine they did experience some level of oppression when they moved here, but probably not to the extent that their darker skinned counterparts would have experienced, or people who weren't upper middle class would have experienced. At one particular point in time, my great-great-grandfather actually owned a lot of property within 2 city blocks in an area in Chicago called Bronzeville. So,
is Bronzeville a common area in the Chicago area that African Americans would have moved to?
It is. Sometimes, as a matter of fact. It was one of the, I think, central hubs for African American life in the U.S., but particularly in Illinois. And even today, there's still a lot. There's still a very heavy African American presence in the Bronzeville area, though these days you have issues with gentrification. So a lot of African American people are, in essence, being pushed out of these particular neighborhoods. But there are still some remnants of black life there.
So, June, what do you mean by gendrification?
Thank you. That's actually a really great question, too. Gentrification is an act in which property developers or certain other people come into a neighborhood that is predominantly black, and where people live who are below a certain poverty level have resided possibly even for years. And they increase the property values. Therefore, people in those particular areas cannot afford to live there anymore. They can't afford to shop for groceries there anymore, etc. So it causes them to have to find other places to go.
Now, June, we've heard a lot about the Chappelle side and how they came, but you said you also had family from Louisiana and Alabama.
Yes.
How did they come to move on the Great Migration?
That is a great question, and I'll try. My family is huge, first of all, so I'm going to try and condense it as much as I possibly can. So Mama, who is biologically my maternal grandmother, she was born in Alabama. Not only did she have family who were also from Louisiana, but also family that up until the earlier, maybe 1930s, we still had family in the Caribbean that, some relatives like my great-great-grandfather was still in contact with. But also on my biological father's side, he is a descendant of people who are from Natchez, Mississippi, which is right on the Louisiana border, a city called St. Joseph, Louisiana, Lafayette, or Maringouin, Louisiana, which is actually French for mosquito, but it sounds a lot better in French. And they're from the New Orleans area. And they moved away due to something very interesting that happened with my father's side of the family. His grandfather, so my great-grandfather, was Mullen Burris. He was born in St. Joseph, Louisiana in 1909. And very surprisingly, which is something that you don't really hear about with people who are in what my generation is called the millennial generation, for those of you who might not know. Some of your parents actually might be millennials too. His father was actually born in 1848. So my great-great-grandfather was actually born enslaved in Louisiana, which is not something you hear about often with people in my generation. Usually it's like 3 or 4 greats back. But for me, because my great-great-grandfather was older when my great-grandpa was born, he was like 61 years old. And with my great-great-grandmother, his third wife, if I'm not mistaken, they had more children together. And my great-grandfather was eventually a sugarcane farmer, not far from the Natchez area, after moving away from Louisiana and, of course, marrying my great-grandmother. Something very bad happened involving a man that he worked for, and therefore they had to leave. And it was at 3 o'clock in the morning, from what my grandmother, or Big Mama, as some of us call her, have told us. She remembers her mother crying a little bit, and when she asked her what was wrong, she kind of shooed her away and told her to go play with my Aunt Dot, who was her sister. And there were about 8 children. So they were packed into a van with actually a station wagon, if I'm not mistaken, with 4 adults in the front seat and all the children in the back. And they did not have the headlights on. They actually made their way out of the city limits by the light of the moon and the stars, because they lived in the country, so that was pretty much all that you could see. And they didn't really feel that they were actually safe until they got to Louisville, Kentucky, and that was like, their safe point. And they felt a little bit relieved from what I remember hearing. So that's like one of the reasons why my family left the Louisiana and Mississippi area. But as far as Mama, who I was raised by, she made her way to Illinois when she was about 8 years old by way of Louisville, Kentucky, or maybe she was 10. But she left Alabama at 5 years old after her mom, unfortunately, passed away. My great-grandfather, he was actually a sharecropper as well. But the men that he worked for would pretty much force him to do certain work for them. And they threatened his life and the lives of his children if he, attempted to leave. So they made their way north because they were snuck out actually by my great-grandfather's sister, my Aunt Rosie, who everyone, even today, even though she died before I was born, everybody still speaks very highly and fondly of her because she was the one who got them out of Alabama late one night.
Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing all of these stories with us, June. It really helps us understand some of those personal stories that brought people from the South to the North and the West on the Great Migration. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, my friends, I hope you learned a little bit more about the Great Migration and that there are a lot of personal stories within the migration itself. And I encourage you to check out your own family's personal stories and how it might connect to this movement here in Illinois and throughout the United States. Thanks for joining me, my friends.